Now, let me talk to you a little bit about the last thing. I'm looking at my, I think I'm going to allow you enough time. Remember, the third principle was Calvin shows us that pastors need far more intense, in-service, ongoing, lifetime training than they're getting. We load all that into seminary, and then we get out there, and you're very fortunate if you occasionally come to a conference like this. You're very fortunate if you might have some kind of local ministerial association or a network that you get together with. But let me tell you what Calvin did. Maybe now, if you were, again, if you were at Scott's workshop, you would have heard about this, but I'll just take 2 minutes on it. Every Friday, Calvin called together what he called the Venerable Company of Pastors. And these were all the pastors, not only in the city of Geneva, but actually even in the environs. So it was really Geneva and the environment. What we would call the suburbs, but that wouldn't be fair because that's not what those things were. But anyway, all the pastors in an area, probably 20, 30 pastors. And every Friday, this is what happened. From 8 o'clock in the morning to 9:30, they had what was called their public conference. I have no idea what the French term was, but I'm not even going to try. The public conference. And what you did for that hour and a half was some pastor basically did an exposition. It wasn't so much a full sermon. It was a little bit more like an exposition, the basis for a future sermon. So what they did was they worked through whole books of the Bible. Each week, a new pastor would come and give an exposition. They did their exegesis, and they presented their exposition. It was kind of like a sermon, but it was more like the bones of a sermon without a whole lot of the other accoutrements you'd put in. And there would be one person who preached for maybe 30 minutes, and then there would be one pastor who was designated to respond, to add, to correct, to make suggestions, to maybe challenge the interpretation of that passage, or to affirm it. And then other pastors would chime in, and usually Calvin would get up at the very end and give his thoughts on the text, and this was open to the public. So the pastors got together, and they in a sense did practice preaching. What was the purpose of this? Because maybe a year from now or 2 years from now, they would all work through that book, but they were working through the book now, making sure they were on the same page in the way in which they interpreted the book. Learning how to do preaching, in a sense, was practice preaching. And it was open to the public. So generally the most, the more, there's always Christians who are the most interested in growing. And so probably more of the eager and more mature lay people would show up. So on Friday mornings from 8 to 9:30, all the pastors got together and took turns preaching through parts of the Bible and then responding to one another and doing critique, and Calvin would get up and everybody would be there then. At the end of the conference, from 9:30 to noon, they went into private. In the private, sometimes they did a little bit more sharp correction or critique of the sermon than they might have done in public. But then secondly, in the 9:30 to 12 noon, they did many, many other things. They did pastoral cases, where they would take a case study of some pastoral problem and they would work through it. Sometimes they actually did have people do some teaching on some area of theology that they were working through, trying to figure out, well, what do we believe about this? They also did brotherly critique, which was not formal discipline, but they called it sharpening. They regularly got together and talked to each other about how they thought one another were doing as preachers, as pastors, as Christians. And they did examine new pastors in order to determine whether or not they should be ordained ministers. And there was just general mutual theological and ethical encouragement. Plus, 4 times a year, I already mentioned this, along with the communion season, they did particular self-evaluation, where they looked at each other. Today we'd call it peer review. Today we'd call it a 360. But what it really was pastors sitting down with each other and telling each other very frankly how they thought they were doing in the pastoral office.
This happened every week, and of course those particular times of peer review happened 4 times a year. Does anybody, any pastors in this room, experience anything like that? No. You can, if you're a Presbyterian, you can actually see, and what Calvin did, this is the historic, this is the headwaters of the Presbytery meeting. This is where the Presbytery meeting came from. But everybody knows, even in the best Presbyterian churches, that this is not what Presbyterian meetings look like anymore. All we do is the business part, partly because we don't meet every Friday from 8 until noon. And if you're not in a Presbyterian situation, if you're in a Baptist situation, congregational, independent churches, things like that, those of us who are in more connectional, traditional denominations, when we do get together, it's all formal. It's nothing like this. We don't work on our preaching. We don't preach through books of the Bible together. We don't work on our unity of doctrine and our purity of doctrine and the quality of our preaching. We don't do that. We don't sit around and do brotherly critique. We don't do that. We don't know each other that well, frankly, and we're too busy with all the logistics. But those of you who are not in traditional connections, you don't get anything like this either. And I would say, going forward, I'm not sure how we are going to survive as the culture gets more hostile. We're going to see more and more people who look like their ministry is doing well go down, just walk away, or fall into doctrinal error, or come under the pressure of the culture to change traditional biblical doctrine, or people who are going to succumb to various sorts of temptations because we don't do anything like this.